So the Epstein files, we've all heard about it now, right? We've seen these files that are millions of emails and photos and so forth of the richest and most powerful men in the world, right? There's presidents, former presidents, the president of the United States, if you're American, your president is there. His name is in there more than anybody else's name, right? All relate to this man who was both a financer, a fixer, a connector, but also a sex trafficker, right? You've got Bill Gates is in there. His wife is very angry about some of this stuff that's come out that poisoned their marriage, I think she said, right? And the question is as men, we don't want to talk about this, right? Because it's uncomfortable, right? It's uncomfortable to talk about the fact that there's a man who has basically been having mutilating and abusing girls, not young women, girls, underage girls, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds, right? And then we've got men in power and men we look up to, Deepak Chopra, for example. That's just one example. Peter Mandelson and a whole host of other people who stayed friends with this man after he was a known pedophile, right? Caught soliciting a 14-year-old prostitute, I think it is, but underage prostitute, right? So this creates a lot of questions for us as men, because I think the uncomfortability with this is we all can look at ourselves and see where is there an aspect of what we're seeing in these men in us. And that's a very difficult thing to sit with. And a lot of the time we push that feeling away because we don't want to. We don't want to go near that, right? Psychologically, consciously or unconsciously, we don't want to go near that because it makes us then feel shame. Right. But I think these are really important conversations to have for us to look at ourselves and actually better ourselves. There is incredible wisdom in facing shame, right? And guilt, because they teach us that we are out of alignment to some degree with who we choose to be, especially guilt, right? Shame can be toxic and corrosive because it's just like, I am bad. But when we can shift that into guilt, which is I did something bad, we can start to learn something. We can start to better ourselves. So I'm going to talk about some aspects that I spoke to initially with some men inside my community around this, because, it's a community that I've built. You've heard me talk about it, and the men are open to sorts of conversations, and it's a safe space that I've created in there that people can share openly about, the way that they're being and so forth. And I think there's some ways that we can take lesson for this and start to look at our own lives and look at ourselves and how we've acted and start to use this to be better instead of just avoiding the conversations about it or being like, those men are in power, they're bad and they're evil, without actually looking at ourselves and going, how, even in the 1% tiny ways, do I do these sorts of things in my life, right? Do they show up in my life where I can start to be aware and so forth, right? So I'm going to go over a few points, and I might meander a little bit because there's just some things I want to talk about, because I think I want to talk more and more about topical points that are occurring that as men we avoid discussing, but also that are related to men and masculinity and how we show up in relationship and how we do love and relationship. Because ultimately, Jeffrey Epstein had certain romantic feelings, sexual feelings towards underage girls, not underage girls, children. Pickly them if you're from a certain part of the world, yeah? And those people around him just were okay with it, right? And rich and powerful men went to parties where this was happening. And as a society, we often are very quick to assume that the victims are lying. That's something that we see a lot. Like, I know the way the legal system works in terms of reasonable doubt and all this kind of stuff, but we have to start to really look at ourselves around this. Around we either blame victims or just ignore them and say that they're lying in some way. Right? Unless it's our sister or our mother, and then suddenly we want to believe these women. So where's this kind of shadow elements? Where's these lessons for men, right? Or our own behavior? So I'm going to start with the first one, which is something I see very, very commonly, right? Which is the kind of wounded inner boy, right? This wounded inner child that men carry around from the days of their school when they were rejected, ignored, maybe even bullied by the kind of popular or attractive women that they wanted, the attractive girls they wanted, that they never could have, right? And they carry this wounded little boy into adulthood. And I see this time and time again. I saw this a lot when I worked in my corporate work, where these boys became IT guys, became managers, became, high up in companies, but they were still underneath carrying this energy of this wounded boy that was ignored during often adolescence by young girls or bullied and so forth. So they go into kind of work and adult life, and they're still yearning to be desired by women who are often younger than them, because they've kind of allowed that part of them to freeze, and it still looks at, say he's a 35, 40-year-old man, right? Say 40, 50-year-old man, he's still looking at 22-year-old women and lusting after them, right? And not being able to control his lust towards them. And I'm going to say something that might be controversial for you. If you're a 50-year-old man and you try and have sex with women who are like in their early 20s, you, for me, are not too much different from Epstein, if I'm honest, because the age gap is so huge. These women are children to you by comparison. I don't care what the legal system says and says it's legal to have sex with them because they're in the early 20s. They are psychologically, emotionally, and physiologically to some degrees, right? They're children. Their brains haven't finished developing. Right? So when you're at that age where you could be their father or maybe even their grandfather, you have to really look at yourself and go, why do I only desire to have sex with these girls, young women, right? But I see this a lot with men, is that we idolize not just youth, because it's one thing to idolize youth and go, okay, like young women are beautiful, they're supple and blah, blah, blah. But it's then to act on that attraction for them in a way that's like, oh, this is totally fine because it's legal. Even though when we look at the emotional aspects of it, of their emotional maturity and who they are, they're really problematic, right? Because ultimately, as a grown-ass man, as a 40, 50-year-old man, if you're chasing after 20-something women, right, you have to really look in the mirror and say, like, is that okay? And I think this is something in society that to some degree is frowned upon and not so much in different circles. But I think this is the thing to look at, is this way in which we become freezed as young boys and we're kind of walking around as adult men in this adult body, but really we're still immature emotionally. We're still immature psychologically, right? And then that makes us attracted to that same level of immaturity in the women that we meet, right? And this might be, for some men, I meet them and they're like, yeah, I'm in my 40s and I'm only attracted to, late 20s, really early 30s women. And you're like, okay, like 20s. This is like, they're in a completely different life stage. How are you really having mature conversation, when you're in completely different life stages? And I think there's something to look at, because there's a maturity, there's an emotional maturity, there's a willingness to receive challenge that you don't really get from some girl that's in her early 20s, right? Or even late teens, which is even worse, right? Where we are desiring this kind of innocence, right? That we never maybe got to experience as a young man, right? So that's the first point I'm gonna really touch on. And then there's this idea around power without kind of responsibility, yeah? At the extreme end, right? Exploitation, coercion, and this kind of abuse of power, which you're very obviously seeing, right? But in the everyday ways, the everyday shadow for the average man is this kind of using money and status and even charisma to kind of bypass emotional responsibility of maybe a duty of care towards someone, or using that power you have in terms of money, status, charisma, or standing in society to wield over someone who is way younger than you, right? We see this with CEOs and C-suite people in companies where they're sleeping with their secretaries and junior members of staff, right? The power difference is huge. But as a man, we have to really acknowledge that in so many situations, women are responding to us, right, in a way that we have power and they don't. And we don't always realize that that is the dynamic at play, because we are also stuck in this little, our insecurities and our fears of being like, oh, I know I'm, a mid-30s man, but I feel insecure because she's hotter than I am, even though she's, 21, 22, 25, what it is. And we don't see the greater kind of power that we have because we are just simply older. And we forget that and we place hotness as the power dynamic and we feel lesser than. And it's a very tricky dynamic, right? But we have to have the self-awareness to even see that that's happening, right? Another way that this kind of power of our conscious kind of plays out is where we start confusing our access to women or access to sex with women with our worth. This is something that a lot of men have ingrained, and I definitely was in this place many, many years ago where I saw my worth as a man being about the number of women I could sleep with, right? And we think that that's what it means to be a good man, to be a worthy man, right? So it's important to kind of see that. And then we have this kind of, I hate this word, I really struggle to say this word, compartmentalization, right? Where we put things into boxes, right? And on the extreme end, it's like a double life. I've got two lives, right? There's this life I have over here, which is like where I'm a good man and I look after my family and I run my company. And over here is where the dark shit happens. It's a little bit like, if anyone's read the book, The Picture of Dorian Gray, he lives this kind of existence where he has his picture in his attic and he goes and sees it and it's this nasty, disgusting human being, but he's this youthful, beautiful man that everyone sees and no one sees his darker side, right? Which is really a story about the shadow in many ways, right? And this kind of way of putting life into double life or different boxes is a really great defense against feeling shame or guilt, right? And how this could sharpen our general day-to-day life is like where we watch porn that contradicts our actual values, our stated values. Like we believe in kindness and care and compassion and so forth, but we watch porn that's really violent, right? And that feels really non-consensual. Right? Because there's a lot of porn that feels really non-consensual. And you could argue that most porn probably fits into that way when we look at the abuse that happens in the porn industry and so forth, right? Or maybe we flirt in ways that crosses a line inside of our relationship, right? It might just be certain words we say or certain ways we are, right? But we insist that we're good, loyal husbands. You see over here, I'm flirting with a woman in a way that crosses the boundaries, but I'm a good man. That was just, that's not what it is. And I think we do this a lot as men. We're like, I'm a good man. But if we look at this deeper behavior, it's like, well, what do you do when you're not the good man? Right? This is a very good question for us to ask, because I think we get lost so often as men. We think we're good men and we're like, why don't women choose us, or why don't our relationships work? And the question was come to me quite often, I've spoken to clients and men before, is what are you like when you're not a good man? What are you like when you get stressed? What are you like when you're angry? What are you like when you don't feel good enough? What are you like when you feel attacked, or where you feel you're being belittled, or when you need an urge to be, satisfied? This becomes a really interesting paradigm, because this is where harm happens. This is where people cheat, when people lie, people steal, people do, watch really cruel porn, or I'm trying to think of more examples. This is when people grope women. Like all these times is like when you're not being that good man, you're something else, you're being some other thing. And this is where we start to downplay the harm we do, because we kind of like put it in another box in our minds and forget we ever did it, or we forget we're doing it. Because, it's harmless or whatever, but actually we're only looking at it from the harm from our perspective and not necessarily how that impacts other people, right? And you see this in the kind of Jeffrey Epstein thing, is when people are saying, I didn't know anything about Jeffrey's stuff. I wasn't party to any of that stuff. That never, went anywhere near me, or I wasn't there. Or when I was there, all the women were of age, or nothing happened between them. It's like we're putting things in boxes. Like Jeffrey's my business associate and friend, but I don't know about his, soliciting young prostitutes. And that's a different thing. We try and pull things apart, right? Bystander. This is a kind of shadow, the bystander shadow. And this one's a really important one, because this is what a lot of these men would have had to have done, right? Which is, we try not to perpetuate harm ourselves. We try to, but if you go back to my point before, we then unwittingly do so because we put things in different boxes, right? But we will often turn a blind eye to a friend, a family member, an old friend, an acquaintance, or even a stranger we see doing harmful things. Right? And we might pass it off as nothing. Like you might have a friend who gropes women in clubs, right? You might have a friend who speaks really disparaging about women, right? And says it's jokes, right? And you kind of laugh along with it. Or you have a friend who is like maybe sexually aggressive, right? And or aggressive in how he chats up and picks up women, right? And you just don't really say anything. Yeah, because you're like, they seem to be liking it. And you forget about maybe 1 in 10 of the women likes it and the other 9 really don't, right? Or you protect your friends when things happen because, hey, that's my boy, that's my brother. I'm using a phrase from Wiley. Some of you might know who Wiley if you're British. Wiley is a grime artist. And he was talking about Getz, is another grime artist who actually killed someone in a hit and run, alcohol-fueled hit and run, as far as I know, which actually didn't happen that far from me. And he was like, that's my brother, he said it on a podcast that I saw recently, and he's like, yeah, that's my brother, I'm always going to support him, and blah, blah, blah. And the first thing I thought was, if that's your brother, you hold him accountable. Isn't that the thing that's really supporting him, right? To hold him accountable. Because we do this because we protect our friends because he's my friend, and then we completely ignore the victims of the act. Yeah? This is some of the shadow. And number five, I think it's number 6 of the points here, right? Objectification. And I think this is probably the one that, as men, can be the hardest one to really live with, the objectification of women, right? Because I was having a conversation with a couple of my friends who I'm actually going to speak to in a few minutes, where we're walking down the street and one of the guys said, he was like, something about a woman that just walked past us who was attractive. And I said, dude, we can't say that, man. And I kind of said it in a semi-joking way. I was like, that's misogynistic to do that. And he was like, no, man, I'm just appreciating this woman. And I said, well, but are you appreciating the whole woman or just what she looks like and your sexual attraction towards her? And then one of the other guys I was with was like, dude, like David's right. Like, and we got into a conversation about this. And I think this is it's not a black and white space because, you know, I can appreciate how someone looks or find them attractive and so forth. But it's this part where we're minimizing to just looks, or a woman's importance solely to her looks or a body part, right? Which is something I see with a lot of men that watch a lot of porn. And I've done this with a number of guys that have watched porn. They've come to me and they want to stop. And then we talk about how to do that. And one of the things I do is ask men to go cold turkey with porn. And the thing that they really notice afterwards is they stop looking at women as just body parts, like titties and arse and face and vaginas and stuff and legs or whatever, right? Then they start to see a whole woman to appreciate. Because when we objectify aspects of women, we just focus on these different aspects of her. And then when we bring that into real life, that's all we focus on, right? And you see this objectification, you know, you might think just like seeing a woman in the street and be like, she's really hot. But ultimately, sexual exploitation, right, is the extreme end of the core part and the extreme end of objectification. It's just like, I'm taking what I want, right? And a man who sets up a literally trafficking to a private island and so forth, he's just trying to fulfill his sexual desire without care for the object of his sexual desire, right? Which is objectification, yeah? And this is where the thin end of the wedge, as they say, right? The fat end being the really extreme bad things, the thin end being this kind of objectification. And I'm not sitting here saying that I'm perfect in this. It's definitely an area that I can look at myself a bit more and I'll be really honest with that, right? But a lot of these things I've mentioned are so ingrained in our society, they're so normalized that we don't question them. We're just like, oh, well, that's normal, that's okay. And just because something's normal doesn't mean it's okay, right? And I want to add as well, like you can be a kind of nice guy, you know, nice guy syndrome type of guy, and believe that you're being nice, you're not doing any harm, you're not perpetuating any harm, but unconsciously you do. Yeah? Because I think sometimes we think I'm a good guy and I don't do anything, right, wrong, ever, because I don't mean to. But intent, action, and impact. Yeah? You hear that? Intent, action, impact. We can have intent that's good, the action we take, but then has negative impact, right? And part of our growth and awareness is to start to observe and be aware of how our actions can impact people. And obviously, sometimes there's some actions which, you know, there will always be some harm sometimes, but it's the level of harm and the type of harm, right? Like especially when we're talking about sexual harm, for instance, it has such deep roots, history and oppression of women and so forth, and how it impacts individual women. Like, we have to be really mindful as men, because like what you might see as like groping, for instance, like, I slapped a woman's ass in a club, for example, something you might just think, it's not a big deal, right? Well, for her, how does that land for her? You might think it's funny and you might think that she thinks it's funny, right? But how does it land for her? It might land as violation of her body. She might feel like she's in danger. It might trigger a past experience of rape for her, right? Which will be, you know, she suddenly goes into a trauma response, all because you slapped some girl's ass, you grabbed some girl's ass, right? You're not thinking about the potential impact of what this could occur, right? And how that is, because you're only thinking about your experience, your own joy or desire. And this is where we have to start to become really mature as men, right? And I know there's a far end of this where we become so anxious we don't do anything because we're so worried about our impact. And I'm not talking about that. This is not a binary conversation. This is a nuanced conversation across the spectrum. But as men, we have to be really aware of how we move through the world and the things that we say and how that really does impact people, right? And we have to have conversations about this, right? We have to have conversations like this on, this is why I'm trying to have podcast conversations like this, right? Because I think this is really important for us to have. Because once you listen to this and you think, oh man, I can see where I'm guilty of some of those things. And now actually David's explained it. I can see how that actually could hurt. Or, I use the kind of old example that I don't like to use, but I think it rams it home into men's heads. It's like, if someone did this to your sister, how would you feel about that? I've got 3 sisters, right? Like if someone in the club randomly grabbed your sister's ass, how would you feel about that? Would you be fine with that? Would that be okay for you? It probably wouldn't be. So like, don't do it. Why would you do that? Or if you had a partner, would you want someone to be catcalling them across the street? Maybe you wouldn't, Or like if you had a partner, if you've got a partner, and I don't like this example because it always paints it as like a woman is only worth thinking about if she's related to you or she's your girlfriend or your partner in some way. But it, like I said, it rams at home in men's psyches and men's minds about this, right? Because we stop seeing women as like this, just some person we don't know, and we become emotionally connected to them as an individual, right? And they become a person who deserves love and care to us. Just in the same way, one of the exercises I get men to do when they watch porn, if they watch porn, is like, watch the porn, but I want you to watch the whole 20-minute video, and I want you to consider this woman as a human being who has a heart, who has love, who has dreams and desires. And as you watch it, really feel that about her and see if you still want to watch this video afterwards when you consider it from that point of view. It's not just your lust and your desire, but also her being, her desires, her wants, her humanity, right? And see if that shifts how you feel, because then we start to expand our awareness beyond just what we want and what we desire, but also onto another human being and how that impacts them. Because what happens, what's obviously happened with Jeffrey and his mates and all these powerful men, is they didn't care. They didn't care. They did not care about these girls and what's going on with them, or they just thought, they like it, they're enjoying it, but they didn't inquire, right? Apart from some of the people who were like no to going to Jeffrey's Island, which there are a number of, right? Or the Deepak Chopras of the world who, I don't know the full details of their relationship, right? But we have to start thinking about beyond our desire and our want, right? And also to the impact of what happens. So hopefully you've enjoyed this episode. It's a big one. And I would love you to share this, right? Because I know maybe a lot of women are going to listen to this, because like this is how I think we should move as men. And if we want men to shift and change, they need to hear conversations like this and not just share the stuff we're angry about, but actually the things that would really support men in thinking more expansively, more widely about how they show up in their lives, their relationships, their dating lives, because this is the game I'm in, helping men show up in a way that's really authentic to themselves, that is serving themselves, serving the women they're with, right? Dropping fear and all that kind of stuff and connecting from a level of realness, right? Because I know that's what creates good relationships. Yeah. The money, the status, all that stuff, it doesn't lead to what you want. So I'll just ask you to share it with somebody, because this is the sort of conversation we want more men to be having, and they're uncomfortable. And I can be an example, or I try to be an example. I'm not an imperfect example, right? Because I'm not perfect. But if you enjoyed this, there's a lot more videos for you to consume. If you're a man and you're wanting to really learn about how to relate, how to connect in a way that's deep and meaningful and is powerful as well, it's potent, is not about just being anxious and placating the women in your life, but actually going after what you want and communicating, being deeply present and in tune so you can feel what's going on with the women you meet instead of just being anxiously worrying about the future with them, right? And create deep intimacy and connection and polarity. I have a program called Relate, which is coming out at the end of March. It'll be starting the end of March. So if you're interested in that, there's a wait list below. Ciao, ciao.